We've just touched upon Hayek's broader intellectual landscape and his place in the Austrian school. Now let's zoom in on a specific period when he was truly a heavyweight in the economic arena, before his later fame as a philosopher of freedom really took off. This chapter dives into his work on money and the business cycle during that crucial pre-World War II era, when he was genuinely considered one of the top dogs, even by those who didn't agree with him. Think of it as his economist superpower phase. Alright, so what did Hayek actually write during this peak period? Well, the big foundational stuff includes his doctoral thesis, Monetary Theory and the Trade Cycle, which he published in German back in 1929. That got translated into English in 1933. Then came Prices and Production, based on his famous lectures at the London School of Economics that really put him on the map for English-speaking audiences. Later, he synthesized much of this into Profits, Interest, and Investment, and culminated it in the Pure Theory of Capital, though that one got delayed by wartime exigencies. Now, here's a fascinating pivot. By the late 30s, while Keynesianism was rising, Hayek himself started shifting focus towards his critique of socialism and the road to serfdom. He saw that project as his main contribution to the war effort, essentially arguing that central planning led to tyranny. But remember, all this monetary cycle work happened before that shift. And the context? Turbulent times. The ghost of German hyperinflation loomed large, and the world was grappling with the aftermath of the 1929 crash. Hayek looked at the US boom and bust and had a very different diagnosis than Keynes. This brings us to the famous showdown between Hayek and Keynes in 1931. Keynes was essentially saying, look, the economy's tanking, let's use government tools. Cut interest rates, throw some money into public projects, maybe slap on some tariffs to protect our industries. We need stimulus. Hayek, however, had a radically different view. He argued that the US boom of the 20s wasn't just a bubble, it was fundamentally flawed because of loose monetary policy. Low interest rates encouraged borrowing and investment far beyond what actual savings could support. His prescription? Do nothing. Let the inevitable correction happen. Trying to prop it up with more spending or easier credit would only make things worse in the long run. It's like trying to patch a leaky roof with more water, it just delays the inevitable flood. Hayek believed these interventions would merely postpone the crisis and make the eventual downturn deeper and more painful. A direct ideological clash over how to manage capitalism's ups and downs. Now, let's step back and look at the economics profession itself during the late 1920s and early 30s. It was a bit of a Wild West situation compared to today's highly technical field. You had tons of theories trying to explain why economies went through booms and busts. Some blamed real-world shocks like new inventions or wars. Others pointed squarely at money supply changes. Still others talked about waves of optimism and pessimism among entrepreneurs. The problem was there wasn't much formal mathematical modeling connecting these ideas. Integration often meant weaving different explanations together into a narrative, like Wesley Mitchell did. In monetary economics, the quantity theory of money, basically the idea that money supply drives price levels, offered a slightly more structured debate. But even there were disagreements. What's crucial is that the monetary theories of the cycle clearly showed these two areas, business cycles and money, were deeply intertwined. Interestingly, despite their later disagreements, both Keynes and Hayek initially found common ground in the work of the Swedish economist Knut Wicksell. Wicksell had this neat idea around the turn of the century. He talked about two interest rates, the natural rate and the market rate. The natural rate is what you'd get if the economy were perfectly balanced, where the amount people want to save exactly matches the amount businesses want to invest. It reflects the real productivity of the economy. The market rate, however, is what banks actually charge, and that's influenced by their policies, especially regarding money creation. Wicksell argued that if the market rate falls below this natural rate, boom, investment outstrips saving. Where does the extra money come from? Banks create it by lending more freely. Hayek's teacher Ludwig von Mises picked up on this. Mises saw this wasn't just about inflation, it was the engine of the business cycle. If interest rates are too low, people consume too much, savings dry up, and eventually you run out of consumer goods. Prices rise, the party stops, the fixed neutral money, keeping the market rate aligned with the natural rate. But here's where things get tricky, what Laidler called an intellectual muddle of impressive proportions. What exactly does this neutral money mean? You can define the natural rate in different ways. Maybe it's the rate where saving equals investment, meaning no new money needs to be created. Or maybe it's the rate where prices stay stable, no inflation. Or perhaps it's the rate reflecting the true productivity of capital goods. In a simple unchanging stationary economy, these definitions line up nicely. But in a growing economy, things get messy. Imagine the economy grows by 4% each year. People need more cash for transactions, so the money supply naturally expands by 4%. At the same time, maybe the natural rate of interest is rising due to innovation. Banks might keep the market rate artificially low, allowing investment to exceed saving, and the money supply is expanding. But because the must supply exactly in line with the 4% economic growth, there's no inflation. So you have zero inflation, which looks like monetary neutrality according to definition 2, but saving is not equal to investment, which suggests non-neutrality according to definition 1. How do you square this circle? Hayek's answer to this muddle was quite decisive. He argued that neutrality fundamentally requires saving to equal investment. Forget the zero inflation definition for a moment. Even if the economy is growing and there's no inflation, because the money supply is expanding just enough to match that growth, if investment is still fueled by bank credit rather than actual savings, the economy is distorted. Resources are being misallocated, too much poured into long-term investment projects, not enough left for immediate consumption. Why does this matter so much? Because the artificially low interest rate doesn't just encourage more investment, it encourages the wrong kind of investment. It pushes producers towards overly capital-intensive methods, stretching production timelines longer than they should be, given the underlying level of real savings. This structural distortion, this misalignment of the entire production structure, is what Hayek identified as the core problem. It's worse than just having inflation or deflation. To achieve true neutrality, he concluded, saving must equal investment, even if that means accepting falling prices in a growing economy. To really grasp why Hayek was so obsessed with this saving equals investment condition, we need to dive into his theory of capital. This is arguably the heart of his cycle theory. Most economists think of capital as a stock of physical stuff, buildings, machines, vehicles. The bigger the stock, the more productive labor becomes. Hayek, following the Austrian tradition, had a different take. For him, capital wasn't just about quantity, it was fundamentally about time. The key property of a capital good is that it allows production to happen over a longer period. Think about building roads. You could do it the old-fashioned way. Lots of workers with pickaxes and shovels. Very labor-intensive, relatively quick process from start to finish. Or you could use massive earth-moving equipment, much more capital-intensive. But making those machines takes time, and making the tools to make those machines takes even more time. The whole process, from the first spark of labor to the final paved road, is much longer. Hayek used diagrams to illustrate this. Look at Figure 1, a three-stage production process. Stage 1 makes machine tools requiring 40 units of labor. Stage 2 uses those tools to make mechanical shovels, another 40 units of labor. Stage 3 uses the shovels to build the road, yet another 40 units. The cumulative output shown represents the total labor embodied at each stage. Now compare that to Figure 2, a four-stage process. Here each stage uses 30 units of labor, but there are four stages: tools, machines, shovels, and finally the road. Notice the total labor input is similar, 120 units, but the process is stretched out over more periods. The key insight is that the length of the production process, the time span from initial input to final output, is what matters for capital intensity, not just the total amount of labor or the number of stages. Now, enter the interest rate. Building takes time, and money tied up in production has an opportunity cost. That's what interest represents. Let's say the interest rate is 10%. For the three-stage process, Figure 1, the total interest cost on the invested labor over time comes out to roughly 12 units of labor value, making the total cost 132. For the four-stage process, Figure 2, the interest cost is higher, around 18, leading to a total cost of 138. If both processes produce the same amount of road, say 1 kilometer, the three-stage process would be cheaper and thus preferred. But what if the four-stage process is more efficient, producing 1.1 kilometers for the same total labor input? If roads sell for $1.20 per kilometer, the four-stage process might actually yield a profit, while the three-stage makes a loss. Entrepreneurs will choose the more profitable, longer process. But now, imagine the interest rate jumps to 20%. The interest cost for the three-stage process might now be 24, making it break even or profitable. The four-stage process's cost skyrockets to 36, turning it into a money loser. Suddenly, the longer process becomes unprofitable, and everyone switches back to the shorter three-stage method. This shows how interest rates directly influence which production techniques are viable. So, what are the big takeaways from this abstract example? First, the capital intensity of a production process isn't just about having more machines. It's measured by the duration of the production process, considering when different inputs of labor are applied. Second, and critically, interest rates act as a signal. When rates rise, it becomes more expensive to tie up capital for long periods, pushing producers towards shorter, faster production methods. When rates fall, the opposite happens. Third, and this is a major departure from simpler models, switching between production processes doesn't just mean using more or less of some generic capital. It means using different types of capital goods. The machines needed for a four-stage process are physically distinct from those needed for a three-stage process. This heterogeneity is key. Hayek realized that standard economic theory, which often focused on equilibrium at a single point in time, wasn't enough. Economic life is lived through time. So he pushed for an intertemporal equilibrium theory. This means understanding how prices evolve over time. Think about it. Prices for identical goods today might be different from prices tomorrow. Why? Maybe technology improves, making production cheaper, so prices tend to fall. In an equilibrium sense, this means people must correctly anticipate these future price changes and factor them into their decisions today. They don't just look at current prices, they look at expected future prices and costs. Hayek was particularly concerned about what happens when things change, like technological progress lowering costs. If production costs fall, but prices don't fall accordingly, it becomes increasingly profitable to produce that good, disrupting equilibrium. Crucially, he argued that even changes in the general price level play a role in resource allocation, especially decisions about producing now versus later. Stabilizing the general price level, he warned, could actually distort the necessary price adjustments driven by real changes, leading to inefficiency. Okay, bringing money back into the picture, Hayek argued in his 1929 work that the elasticity of the currency volume is the root cause of the trade cycle. Remember Wicksell and Mises? The natural rate of interest adjusts to real economic conditions, like new inventions boosting productivity. But the market rate set by banks often lags behind. Why? Fractional reserve banking. Banks take deposits, hold only a fraction as reserves, and lend out the rest. This creates money. When the natural rate rises, savers deposit more, banks compete for loans, and they can temporarily expand credit without raising rates, keeping the market rate below the natural rate. But eventually, banks run out of reserves and have to hike rates. This elasticity, this ability of the money supply to stretch and shrink based on bank liquidity, means the market rate doesn't always reflect the real equilibrium rate. Hayek's conclusion was stark. The very structure of banking makes monetary fluctuations inevitable. Avoiding them would require fixing the total amount of bank deposits, but he acknowledged that might stifle progress by keeping interest rates too high. So, how did Hayek apply this theory to the unfolding Great Depression? He argued that the 1920s U.S. boom, despite appearing stable with roughly constant prices, was actually fueled by overly expansionary monetary policy. According to his theory, true neutrality in a growing economy should have involved falling prices. The fact that prices stayed flat suggested the money supply was expanding too quickly relative to real savings. This kept interest rates artificially low, encouraging that shift towards longer, more capital-intensive production processes. Then came the bust. Eventually, banks couldn't sustain the low rates and had to raise them. Suddenly, those long, complex production lines became unprofitable. The problem: all those specialized intermediate goods, like the custom machinery for the four-stage process, were already made. Producers wanted to switch back to simpler, shorter processes, but it takes time to adjust. Factories close, but the new, simpler factories haven't opened yet. Workers lose jobs, unemployment spikes. The depression, in Hayek's view, was the painful, unavoidable process of the economy, unwinding these unsustainable structures and returning to a sustainable, though perhaps less productive, configuration. Now, Hayek wasn't static. After the devastating impact of the Depression, his thinking evolved. He started questioning the extreme reliance on perfect equilibrium. In his 1937 paper, Economics and Knowledge, he grappled with whether equilibrium even makes sense when applied to groups of individuals with dispersed knowledge. He moved towards a broader concept. Equilibrium isn't just about static consistency, but about the consistency of beliefs with outcomes and with each other's beliefs. This shift meant he placed much greater emphasis on expectations. How do people anticipate the future? And crucially, how do those expectations affect behavior, sometimes amplifying downturns? He began exploring scenarios where rigidities like sticky wages or prices, or even self-fulfilling prophecies, could make recessions deeper and longer, potentially preventing the system from ever reaching a stable state. It's a move away from pure equilibrium towards a more dynamic, expectation-driven analysis. Hayek's magnum opus on this topic, The Pure Theory of Capital, published in 1941, aimed to provide a more systematic integration of money and capital theory. The linchpin? The interaction between monetary factors, interest rates, money supply, and real factors, the structure of production, the nature of capital goods, via the price system. He firmly believed that the essence of the business cycle lay in this interplay. Looking at Keynes' general theory, which had become hugely influential, Hayek was scathing. He felt Keynes had thrown out the baby with the bathwater, focusing almost exclusively on short-run monetary manipulation and demand management, completely ignoring the deep-seated constraints imposed by the real side of the economy, specifically the structure of capital. Keynes treated capital as a uniform blob, easily shifted around. Hayek insisted it was heterogeneous, specific, and difficult to redirect once established. His critique was fierce, calling Keynes' approach a betrayal of economics and a threat to civilization, obsessed with short-term fixes while ignoring long-run realities. So, how should we evaluate Hayek's contribution? On one hand, his methodology was clear. He believed you couldn't understand fluctuations without first understanding equilibrium. He famously claimed that static analysis was the only way to explain fundamental phenomena like prices and incomes, which are essential for understanding fluctuations. He even went so far as to say that the existence of unemployed resources wasn't explained by static analysis, implying a strong faith in its explanatory power. Even after his 1937 shift, he retained a modified equilibrium concept as a benchmark for analyzing dynamics, focusing on situations where plans remained consistent because people correctly anticipated others' actions. His ultimate goal was to demonstrate, using this Austrian theory of capital, that capitalism inherently suffers periodic unemployment spells and that an elastic money supply makes these spells worse. But Hayek's approach faced significant hurdles. The biggest challenge was developing a rigorous dynamic theory of how capital stocks and production actually change over time under these conditions. This is incredibly complex, especially when you factor in heterogeneous capital goods that become obsolete. The mathematical tools and computational power simply weren't available to Hayek to build and test such intricate models deductively. As a result, he couldn't formally prove some of his key claims, like the precise negative relationship between interest rates and the length of production periods. His theory remained more of a powerful illustration of potential mechanisms, rather than a watertight deduction of what must happen. Another issue was empirical. His theory heavily relied on the assumption that capital goods are indeed heterogeneous and specific. While true for some things, many capital goods can be adapted. Quantifying this specificity is tough. Finally, Hayek's theory got overshadowed by Keynesianism. Keynes' theory, despite its own methodological weaknesses, offered a simpler, more elegant framework that was easier to work with mathematically and statistically. Hayek himself didn't really engage in statistical testing of his ideas. So Keynes won the day, at least for a while. In conclusion, Hayek's work on money and the business cycle, particularly during his pre-war peak, offered a compelling if complex alternative narrative. It emphasized the importance of the real economy's structure, particularly capital, and how monetary policy could distort it, leading to inevitable cycles. While his theoretical rigor in modeling dynamic adjustments was limited by the tools of his time, and his empirical grounding was weaker, his insights about the dangers of monetary meddling and the significance of capital structure resonated deeply. These ideas wouldn't fully resurface until decades later, during the 1970s supply-side revolution, though economists then used different analytical tools. Hayek laid important groundwork, even if his immediate impact was overshadowed.